Sometimes Paul is so compressed in what he says that if you just translate the words, you're translating nonsense. That for the translator then, they have to figure out what words to add to make sense out of what Paul says. In Romans 10, Paul basically has his version of the Great Commission. In verse 13, he says, "For everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved." And then he goes through this iteration of how can they call on someone they haven't believed? How can they believe if they've never heard? How can they hear if no one preaches? And how can they preach if they aren't sent? And then you get down to verse 17, and this is the verse in question. And word for word, it is, "Therefore, consequently, faith from hearing, and hearing from the word of Christ." Now, there's two basic questions here that a translator is going to have to solve. First of all, so faith comes from hearing. Well, if you read this in context, you can figure out what it means. But if you look just at the verse, it's nonsense. Faith doesn't come from hearing. What? Hearing birds chirp? Hearing classical music? Hearing your friends talk? See, it just doesn't make any sense if you leave it by itself. And then the second question that a translator has to deal with is the word of Christ. What's that? Is it a word about Christ? Is it something that Christ said? What is word of Christ? It's so ambiguous that it really is difficult to understand. Part of this question is solved by looking at the semantic range of akoe. It can refer to the faculty of hearing, to the act of hearing, to the organ of hearing, in other words, the ear, and it can also refer to that which is heard. So you see down here in 4b, you have account, report, message. If you look at the different translations, you're going to see what's going on. And the ESV just leaves it word for word. Faith comes from hearing, and hearing from the word of Christ, which of course is how we're used to, if you're raised in the church, is how you're used to understanding it. But it doesn't mean a whole lot. And so you can see the NIV struggling, and where it says faith comes from hearing the message. In other words, hearing the gospel message. And the gospel message is heard through the word about Christ. You know, with many of these genitive constructions, you either have a subjective or an objective genitive. If word of Christ, if Christ is a subjective genitive, then it is what is doing the action of the speaking. If it's an objective genitive, it's receiving the force of the speaking. But most likely here, and the NIV I think has got it right, it's an objective genitive. It is the word that is said about Christ. That was the gospel message. So the NIV has supplied a direct object, and it's defined the awkward of as being about Christ. Both legitimate translations. If you look at some of the other translations, the NASB, so faith comes from hearing, and hearing by the word of Christ. So they leave it, as you would expect, ambiguous. ESV we've looked at. The CSB, so faith comes from what is heard, and what is heard comes through the message about Christ. See what they're doing? So they're trying to solve the same problem the NIV is, but without adding the word message in. Go to the NRSV, so faith comes from what is heard, and what is heard comes through the word of Christ. Again, as you would expect, pretty basic, word for word. The Net Bible, consequently, faith comes from what is heard, and what is heard comes through the preached word of Christ. So they've added the word preached in there to indicate that it is an objective genitive. Look what the NLT does. This is fascinating. So faith comes from hearing. So they leave the first half of this famous verse alone. But then they want to explain what hearing means. And so they say, well, that is hearing the good news. That's the message. That's what is preached. Hearing the good news about Christ. So once again, you see the NLT being very free with the words and yet trying to convey the actual meaning. So again, this is a great illustration of the kind of complexities there is in translations and translations will differ depending upon their philosophy. Some will err on the simple word-for-word translation as much as possible, even if it is confusing or misleading. Others will try to explain the authorial intent a little clearer, and hence why we have different translations.